In order to add event handling to our form, we'll need to get back to our form designer. Let me just close this up and close this up, which I'm not going to need yet, and bring up our form. Now, when you start writing code to interact with controls on your form, it's really useful to set the name property so that you can remember what the name is. So for this one, I'll change the name to instruction label. For the button, I'll change the name to greeting button. And for this text box, I'll change the name to name text box. In addition, we want to change the prompt. Here, enter your name is already set, but for this button, I'll change the text to be greeting. There we go. And of course, we could rearrange this, maybe move this down, make this a little taller so the G shows up. There we go. And so on. It's really up to you. And maybe the label should appear to the left of the text box it's modifying. There we are. Move the text box out of the way, move the button out of the way. It's a work of art. Okay, now I'd like to add code so that when I click that greeting button, something happens. To make that happen, the easiest way to do this is to double click on the button. But before I do this, let me show you on the Properties window the Events tab. Here's a listing of all the events that this control exposes. Right now I'm on the form. Let's choose the button. You can see Greeting button selected there. And here's a list of all the events that that button has available to it. I could double click here to add an event handler. But since I'm working with a button, if I just double click on that button, it will place me in the code editor, and the code editor will create for me an event handler for the default event of the control. Every control has one event set aside as its default event, and for a button control, that's the click event, the one you're most likely to want to add code to. Now we'll investigate events in more detail later, but for now let's just put some code in here. I'll add this dot text equals, so it'll set the value of the form's text property. This refers to the current form, and we'll say hello, and add to that the value in name text box dot text, and maybe even an exclamation point. There we go. So we'll insert that information into the caption of the current form. Let's save everything and try it. We'll run it. Enter a name there. And click the button, and you see the caption of the form changes to match the text we've indicated that should appear there. So we've done it. We've written a Windows application. It actually does something. Not very interesting, but something. So in a very simplified form, you've seen all of the major tasks involved in creating a Windows application. That is, you have to have a form, either using the default one or add one to the project. You add controls to that form, laying out your user interface. You set properties of those controls, and then add event handling code to make the form do something. You've seen that you can set properties at design time, and we also set a property at runtime here. We set the text property of the form to be some specific text at runtime. Let's expand our form a little bit by adding some more behavior to it. Maybe we can add a menu to it, just to play with the menu tools in Visual Studio. So let's go to our toolbox here and find, well, I don't see it there, but there's a Menus and Toolbars section. So let's add a menu strip to our form. A menu strip goes at the top of the form and allows you to create a menu. Let's come here and type Options. We'll add an options menu to our form. And down here we can add what options we want. And I'll choose Greeting Language. And then here I can add a flyout menu. English and French, say. Okay, well, let's set some more properties of this thing. These are just controls I've added to my form. If we looked at that code portion that lays out the controls, you'd see that. And here I can set properties of these. So this must be a tool strip menu item. We can set its checked property to true. Notice you can double click, I'm doing this here, to toggle between states of Boolean properties. Also, I want it to check the value when I click on it, so I'll set that property to true. And I'll repeat that for the French. Check on click, set it to true. Okay. We also need to make sure that the form knows that this is the current menu strip. You might have multiple menu strips and only want one visible when the form first opens. So for the form, let's find the menu strip property. Let's find the main menu strip property and make sure it's set appropriately, and it is. Let's again save everything and run this. And I now have a flyout menu. And of course, I just chose French, and now they're both selected. So something's wrong with that concept. We'll need to add some code because you want it so if you choose French, English gets unchecked. So whichever one you select unchecks the other item. Making users uncheck items themselves is not very friendly. Okay, well that really doesn't work yet, but we can add code to make it work. Let's go back to Design View. Find our French menu item, double-click it, and again, this takes us to the default event handler for that item, that control, the tool strip menu item, which is, of course, its click event. I'm inserting a line feed just so you can see the entire declaration for this event handler. We'll talk about how it all works a little later on. For now, let's just add the code. I need French tool strip menu item, and I just need to type enough to see its name in the list of items, and I can press Tab to select it. So if I click French, I want its checked property to be true, and I want the English one, English tool strip menu item dot checked to be false. So that should take care of that issue. Let's go back to our design, get the English tool strip menu items click event handler. I can just take these two. I'll control, click, and drag to make a copy. If I just dragged them, they would have moved them. I used control, click, and drag. I could also have copied them to the clipboard and pasted them back in. However you want to move them is up to you. I'll change French checked to false and English checked to true. So now, when I choose either one of those, the other one gets checked. Now, in the greeting button, we need to modify this code to take into account our language. So I can put here if, and then in parentheses, English tool strip menu item dot checked. Then we do this. I'll put it in braces because I like putting things in braces in if-then-else statements. There we go. Else, and let's put the braces in and make a copy of this. I will again control, click, and drag down here. And this time, let's put it in Francais. Now this is the limit of my French, I've got to tell you. There we go. We have now inserted French text instead. So if the English tool strip menu item is checked, we say it in English. Otherwise, we say it in French. Let's save everything and run it. So right now, English is selected. And if I put, say, my name in here, it comes up in English. Let's change it to French. And look, we got French. How exciting. Okay, well that was simple enough. We can add a few more touches to this. If I open the form file up again, maybe I want to make it so that I can select these items without having to actually select them on the menu. That is, with the keyboard, select them. So one way to do it is to come to the text property of the menu item and add an ampersand. That adds an underscore character, so that acts as a hotkey for that menu item. So I could just type E or F at that point. In addition, you can provide a keyboard shortcut for a menu item. There's a shortcut keys property of an item. There it is. Let's choose a shortcut key. Let's choose, in this case, Control, Shift, and here, let's choose E. For this one, we'll choose Control, Shift, and F, and you can see that the shortcut key appears on the menu. Let's save it again and run it one more time. And if I choose Options, Greeting Language, and now press F, it should have chosen French for me. And it did. Let's try a different way. With nothing open at all, I'll press Control Shift E. You can't see that I did it, but I did. Let's choose Options, Greeting Language. That didn't work. Let's try again. I close it up, press Control Shift E. The first time my fingers missed, I pressed Control Start and E. That was not the right combination. Control Shift E, and English is selected. Let's try it again. Control Shift F, and now French is magically selected. So clearly, there are a number of things you'll need to add to menus to give them full functionality so they work like normal menus within any other Windows application. We can also add non-graphical components to our form. Those are those components I was talking about that the dispose method plays with directly. Well, we already have one. We have our menu strip, but it has a visual representation. Some components have no visual representation on the form. For example, a tooltip component. We can go to our toolbox and find the tooltip. It shows as a control. It's really a component because it appears not on the form itself, but in the tray below the form. And there's nothing on the form to indicate that we've added that tooltip. You can have multiple tooltip controls, and each one have a different set of tooltips. Maybe you want to have different languages or in different contexts, have different tooltips appear. Now let's choose our text box control, and notice that if we scroll down, we're going to find, it's easier if I bring it full screen or make it bigger there, we'll find a tooltip on tooltip 1 property. That wasn't there before. There was no tooltip anything before I dragged this onto the form. This control, when I dragged it onto the form, added an extended property to the text box. It did it for the button as well, and I'm guessing for the label as well, allowing me to set a tooltip. So I'll enter a tooltip here, name used in greeting. So that text appears when I hover the mouse over that control at runtime. Let's try it. I pressed F5 to start the form up, and now if I hover the mouse over this, I see nothing. If I hover the mouse over this, I see my tooltip appear, the tooltip I specified in that tooltip component. There's another component we can use that might be useful for you, and that's the timer component. Let's go find that timer. Doesn't appear here, but it should appear in the Components tab. Way down there is a timer. Drag it onto the form, and it doesn't appear on the form, it only appears in the tray below the form. Now the timer has an interval property which is set to 100 milliseconds by default. And the enabled property, by default, is false. We won't modify those here. We can modify those elsewhere, in code, for example, or you could modify them here if you want. But we don't want the timer to be enabled yet. We only want it to be enabled once we attempt to close the form. Our goal here is going to be to make the form fade out when I close it, just to prove that we can. Notice, by the way, the form has a property named opacity. The opacity property is set to 100% by default, but I can change it to any other percentage and it will appear ghostly on the screen, getting more transparent as you change this value to a lower number. What we're going to do in the timer component is as it ticks away, because it will run at regular intervals specified by this property, we're going to set the opacity property to smaller and smaller values. Well, let's try this. First of all, I'll double-click on the timer, which will take me to the tick event handler for that timer. Now I'm going to rely on a variable to tell me if it's okay to close the form or not. So I'll make a private Boolean variable named OK to close and set it equal to false. So that variable by default is set to false. And then inside this procedure, let me add some code and then we'll discuss it. This dot opacity minus equals 0.05. That reduces the opacity by 5%. If this dot opacity is less than, if we've gotten down far enough so that we're nearly invisible, let's add code that tells the form that it's okay to close and then actually close the form. Now, why do I need that okay to close variable? Because our form's closing event handler will check that variable and determine if it can actually close or not. Because we want to make sure at the time we try to close the form, we don't actually close the form, we get the timer ticking instead of closing the form. Let's go back to the Forms Designer and add code to the form's form closing event. Now, I couldn't just double-click on the form because that would have taken me to the wrong event, that's for sure. I want the form closing event, which is not the default event of a form. The default event, by the way, is the load event. So I'll double-click it here to create the form closing event handler. Here, I can add code. If it's not okay to close, and that'll be the default value, if it's not okay to close, what do we do instead? We tell this form to cancel its close. And we do that by setting the cancel property of the parameter that's passed to us here in the second argument, E. Every event is handed an argument, normally named E, in this second slot, which could have information that the form or the object itself will use. Here, we'll set the cancel property to true, so we'll cancel the close, and also set this dot timer1 dot enabled equal to true. When you enable the timer, it starts ticking away. Every 100 milliseconds, it's going to cause the form to get paler and paler until it finally just disappears. We might want to extend that time on the delay on this. 100 milliseconds is a very short period of time. So let's go back to the properties. Let's make this not be 100 milliseconds, but say 500 milliseconds, half a second. So it will take a few seconds to actually cause this form to disappear. Now that's going to take an awfully long time. Let's make it a fifth of a second instead. Let me save everything and try running it. Here goes. All right, well, we know about the tooltip. We know about the languages. Let's try closing the form and watch what happens as we do. And the form finally closes after it iterates through all those opacities until the opacity becomes less than 5%. At that point, the form actually does close, releasing all of its resources, and we've used events and event handlers to do 3 different things. Click a button, something happens. Choose a menu item, something happens. Close the form, something happens. And actually, there's a 4th. The timer event handler for its tick event allows us to cause the opacity of the form to decrease at regular intervals.